Hi, James. How are you? How's everything in London?
It's good. The sun's shining. Finally, we've been waiting for that moment for about the last 2 weeks. So it must be a good time drinking champagne. Obviously,
It's always a good time for drinking champagne, but as you say, if the sun's out and we're in England, we'll make the most of it.
yeah,
So,
quite right.
James, I wanted to thank you for joining me today for the tasting that we're going to do. It's quite a treat having champagne and Pol Roger and yourself being an MW. I was hoping that to start, you could give the audience a little bit of a background on yourself and then also
Yeah.
on the impressive brand that is Pol Roger.
So just a quick bit about myself. I joined the wine trade an awfully long time ago. I think it was about 1986. I was lucky enough. I did classics up at Cambridge, but at the same time as playing a bit of rugby, I also did blind tasting because there is a varsity blind tasting match. So I competed for Cambridge against Oxford, I think in 85 and 86, and thought it was fun. We lost by a point in the first year and won in the second year. So when I finished up there, I thought, let's try and join the wine trade. So I started with a company called Mentzendorff, who are the Bollinger Champagne lot. So did 6 or so years there, then jumped ship to Pol Roger 20, God knows what years ago, 28, 29 years ago, and got stuck there. And I was put through, fortunately, the MW, where early 90s, 92, 93. It was the year I did my knee in playing rugby, so I was on crutches for a month or so. So therefore, I did some work instead. So I'm fortunate I passed the MW when it was easier. And so, yes. And so I've ended up being a Pol Roger for most of my life. So I think I half know what's going on now. But though working for the French, you never entirely know what's going on. It's always a slight mystery.
And how about the brand Pol Roger then? Can you give us a bit of the history?
So Pol, we've been doing, one of the joys of lockdown is doing lots of research on Pol, the history, the stories, and the whole Churchill connection, because we were always slightly hazy about some stuff. But actually, we're now far cheerier, far more secure about the history, the connection. Pol is one of the very, very few family-owned houses left in Champagne. Most of Champagne got bought out by the big multinationals, 70s and 80s. But Pol's one of the three, along with Bollinger and Roederer, family-owned houses left. Because they were lucky, they had a stack of vineyards, because vineyards is what makes Champagne rather than necessarily the brand name. And also extraordinary, it's got this amazing reputation in the UK market. Everyone out there thinks Pol's an enormous house, but actually this year they'll only do 1.8, 1.9 million bottles a year, which against the context of Champagne, it's about 300 million bottles a year, is 0.5, 0.6% of the whole thing. But the UK is bigger, and it's also it was the first Pol Roger market. Pol started selling in the UK in the 1860s, 1870s. And so we've always overperformed over here. And so everyone gets this impression we're this enormous house, but actually we're quite small, quite smart, but very vineyard inspired. We have about 50% of what we need from our own vineyards and 50% bought in from elsewhere. But by comparison, that's a high proportion of owned vineyards. And that's really what's kept Pol family owned secure financially for the last 50, 60 years.
So it's about having the control within the vineyards, you say, because they own it and they can make key decisions.
I mean, it's also a financial thing. There are some of those big champagne houses have got, I mean, Moet, who are the biggest players in Champagne, Moet producing about 30 million bottles a year, but they're only 20% self-sufficient. So if you're having to buy grapes from growers for the rest of it, A, it's expensive, and B, it means you don't have quite that same control. And it also means feasibly your blend can change a bit over the years or from year to year. And even the 50% Pol are buying in, they tend to buy from the same people year in, year out. And that also helps. It's that family-owned connection because the De Bees, the Pol Rogers, they're at school in Champagne, university in Champagne, and so they know everyone. And I think people still like dealing with Pol, and that makes it easier to get hold of good grapes and occasionally to get a few more contracts.
And it's the relationship, isn't it, that you're discussing and having such close proximity with these people, with the vineyards, and the control, therefore.
I mean, I think what's fun, despite, I mean, one or two of these family-owned houses, it tends to be absentee landlords. Pol Roger are firmly there. if you go up the Pol based in Epinay, that's the heart of Champagne. And so if you drive up the Avenue de Champagne, on the right-hand side, you have Moet, then you have Perrier-Jouet, but then you have Pol Roger. You have the Pol Roger Cellars house, but then you have where Hubert lives, then where Christian Pol Roger used to live, then where Christian de Bie lives. So they have a serried rank of houses there. And Christian de Bie, who is 92, born in 28, might be 93 this year, Christian can still walk out of the back door up to the office as he does every morning to check what's going on. And so they're very much there, involved, full time.
I think that's the great way to start the tasting. So where would you like to start?
So what you've got, I've been drinking solidly for weeks. So we've sent the bottles down Guy to taste. That's good. We've got the non-vintage, going left to right. Non-vintage, vintage, Churchill, and the Rich. Non-vintage. What's fun about non-vintage now is our biggest selling champagne. It's about 85% of what we do in the UK. But until the mid-50s, Pol Roger didn't actually bring a non-vintage to the UK market. Pol Roger was only a vintage champagne house for the first 100 years of production, certainly as far as the UK is concerned. So non-vintage is newer. And what we all need to remember about non-vintage, it's a wine that we produce every single year. Historically, it was because you had some really bad years. There are now very few really bad years, but there are some good years. So what we're trying to do with non-vintage is standardise that blend, standardise the taste over a period of time. But the standard Pol cuvee, third of each of those grape varieties, third Chardonnay, third Pinot Noir, third Pinot Meunier, and 4 years pre-disgorgement. Remembering with champagne, you could release it after 15 months, which we think is far too bloody young. But 4 years gives you time in a cellar to do the second fermentation, then also to pick up some of those yeast flavours. And so it's a well-aged non-vintage with a relatively low dosage, the sugar we put at the end. And it's the Pol style. Each champagne has a different style. And the Pol non-vintage style, it's stainless steel, fresh, cool fermentation, and then long maturation. So we're aiming for that perfect aperitif, whether it's 11 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's actually a quaffing champagne. And we try and maintain that style year in year. It will change as the base wines change. But at the moment, we're sitting mostly on 16 with some 15 and 14. So this is an old wine. And hopefully that benefits from that ability to have some maturity to it.
It's also a very important wine for the house and for any brand to have the staple, to really have an identity. And a lot of what you're talking about brings that. It can't just be an everyday one, because it's where you're positioning yourself in the market. And even as a standard cuvee, a non-vintage, it's still important to have that for the brand. And it comes across, it's very well balanced. It's the first thing I picked up. Really beautiful coating of the tongue, but everything felt in kink with itself. That's the right way of putting it. Nothing jumped out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're effectively looking, you want freshness of fruit. Don't forget, the wine in Champagne's quite old. We're also used to drinking white wine that's a year, 2 years old. In the case of Pol Roger, we're talking about wine that's 4.5, 5 years old, with some older proportion in it. And it's the question of getting that maturity there, but also the freshness. I mean, we're all excited about English sparkling wine at the moment, but Champagne is still a fairly northerly wine-growing area.
It is.
And the natural acidity in the base wine and the end wine is still pretty high. So we're trying to maintain that freshness, which is accentuated by the carbon dioxide. Freshness with maturity, just to make something that drinks well now. And significantly with Pol, it would easily take another 3, 4, 5 years in bottle in a decent cellar. And I think it's that's very much the house style. Comparing ourselves to someone like Bollinger, who I used to work for, make bloody good wines. They're very much Pinot Noir dominated, and they do oak fermentation. Pol Roger chucked out their last oak cask in the 50s. They were one of the first with, it used to be steel, iron. Now it's absolutely stainless steel, state-of-the-art, temperature-controlled stuff. And so we're looking absolutely the antithesis of the Bollinger style. Both great styles. We're reductive, to be technical about it. Bollinger's oxidative. And so we're looking for that freshness. So it's fresh now, and it will be fresh even if it sits in a good cellar for 3 or 4 years.
And I think what's good about retaining the freshness is it has more ability to pair with lots of different food groups. And it's also, you get a lovely, the fresh acidity, I think, is key to sparkling wines and champagne, because it gives it a defining edge, which is what you're mentioning.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's, I mean, looking at international wine styles, I think that's where England and Champagne do it best, because Absolutely. We are with marginal areas. You get some of those big heavyweights, whether it's from Spain or South America or Australia or America, and they're just a bit hot and a bit big and a bit clumsy. And effectively, what we like to have with a decent bottle of champagne is something you can drink, something you can finish the bloody bottle. A bottle shouldn't be exhausting for 2 people to drink, or frankly, if you're a Churchill, for 1 person to drink. But it should be refreshing. And I think hopefully Pol does that. And as you're saying, it works with food. I think everyone's terrified of putting champagne with anything else. It's supposed to be aperitif, then we move on to white wine for the first course. It's largely total rubbish. Champagne is far more adaptable, flexible now as food styles change. Frankly, if you're going Asian, Spanish, anything spicy, an unoaked, fresh champagne is a great combination. Even Pol Nonvintage is fabulous with sort of Thai green curry or lamb curry or beef curry, because you've got acidity and a bit of sweetness there. So he's more adaptable.
Yeah, I've been to a few dinners where we have had sparkling wines paired right the way through, and as you say, it's a wonderful wine to do that with. Just a lot of people don't think of how you can marry a lot of the complexities that you get within these wines instead of just going for your standard stills.
About 3/4 of the way through, you think you need a glass of red wine. I think champagne works most of the way through, but at some point, with big red meat, venison, beef, lamb, champagne hasn't really got the structure to stand up to it. I think do your red wine, then you have your sweet champagne with pudding. So let's get all our priorities right. Or even you could have red wine from champagne, but we don't do one, and we're not overly excited about it. But no, Pol NV is the ultimate aperitif style. And qualitatively, we talk about occasion. I think qualitatively, champagne is now significantly better than it was 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. There is a global warming element to it because we are picking earlier than we used to. Historically, if you go back 30 years, they were picking in Champagne end of September to early October. And now, on average, we're picking end of August to early September. So effectively, the harvest has moved a month back. The end of September to early October is now populated by the English sparkling wine boys,
exactly.
who then run the same risk that we did 10, 20, 30 years ago about difficult autumns. But it means that our vintages are now far more consistent. But it's still that non-vintage style is a good way of smoothing out some of the challenges. There are frankly very few bad vintages in Champagne anymore. You just have good and better vintages.
Well, that's great news for everybody.
Yeah, but we will. It'll be really nice. Perhaps I think Champagne will outlive me. I think I'm all right. It'll be interesting to see the next 2 or 3 generations. It's getting warmer, but then you have a June like we've had in the UK. Which I wouldn't be thrilled if I was a wine grower in the UK or vineyard owner in the UK.
It's still very, I mean, if touch and go is the right phrase, but there always seems to be a little bit of tension in the early part of the summer here. We're still a bit like, what's going to happen? How's it going to pan out? So,
well, you have that, and then you have this huge tension at the end of the season, at that September, October level, because what makes a great sparkling wine is grapes picked in good condition, effectively good condition without any rot. Rot is exacerbated by warm, wet autumns and lots of rain. And it is getting warmer, but you still have rain in September, rain in October. But we haven't had a vintage in October in Champagne for 30 years. And I think the figure is, should we say, 15 out of the last 20 vintage in Champagne, they've started picking in August. It screws up the French holiday season, though. Because in days gone by, as we all used to know, they all used to go on holiday in August, but they're having to come back a week earlier now.
Well, as long as the wines stay at that quality, I'm all right with them doing that. That's fine. So I think to sum up with this champagne, it's just very smooth, well balanced. It's quite delicate, which I wasn't expecting to have quite as much finesse, but it's very easy to drink. And I like that. I like when you have wines that are just really enjoyable. And it's not a question of lacking complexity or things being out of key, but it's just nice to have a wine that's easy to drink and you just knock it back, to be frank.
We like the finesse is absolutely what Pol's looking for. They're looking, don't forget, we're hand-picking everything, we're pressing it quickly, we're letting the must, the grape juice settle in the press house in 24 hours. We're then bringing it back to Epinay, letting it settle again, refrigerated for a little bit for another 24 hours. So we end up with a very clean must. And then we end up with a slow, cool fermentation, playing around with stainless steel and temperature control. And absolutely, finesse is the word we're looking for.
Yeah.
Non-vintage should be characterful, but it also should be easy drinking. It really is. It's a wine you drink happily, and you could drink quite. We all go to when we're all allowed to go to weddings, God knows what. You want something you could drink happily for 2 hours without being upset about it.
Absolutely.
And it's got this. There is a bit of dosage in that. For those who don't know, this is the sugar that we put in to, as it were, counterbalance the acidity. But even over that last 30-year period, the dosage has reduced by about a third. But there's still some sugar there, just to cut the acidity a little bit. But we're looking for, it's all about balance when it comes to champagne. And especially when you've got the Pol style, which is the stainless steel, cool fermentation style, you need it. So it's quality of the grapes and the process that you're putting into the finished wine.
Absolutely.
So no, entirely. The danger is you can drink too much.
Yeah, absolutely. But in a way, that's good though, because we do want something that's easy drinking. Yeah. I think it's the perfect way to move on to the next champagne.
So you've got, lucky enough, you've got some Pol Roger Vintage 2013, which I tasted again I haven't tasted for ages. I had a lunch up in Oxford on Tuesday, and we showed it before lunch, and it's absolutely brilliant at the moment. So Pol Vintage is a step up in terms of quality. It's a few years older step up in terms of age, but it's also the archetypal Pol stuff. We sell Pol Roger much more vintage than anyone else. We're about 15% of our total is vintage. And what we mean by vintage when it comes to Pol Roger is the product of a single year. Whilst non-vintage products are 2, 3, 4 years, this is single year. Historically, we'd have made 3 or so vintages a decade. Nowadays, the quality of the vines, the weather is such you could do 4 or 5 vintages a decade. But effectively, we're looking for grapes that are coming in really good condition and clean, healthy, wholesome. And then we'll keep looking at them, we'll press them, we'll ferment them. And then the January, February after the vintage, it will be decided whether base wines are good enough to make a vintage Pol Roger. So whilst the first one, the non-vintage, is a third of each, this is a 60-40 blend, 60 Pinot, 40 Chardonnay. So that Pinot Meunier we've used for the non-vintage is great because it matures a bit quick, stays there and comes down. Pinot Noir is what you need for longevity in Champagne. Don't forget, Pinot Noir is a red skin grape variety. It's a grape variety of red Burgundy. So it does have tannin, it does have backbone and structure. And even a white wine can have tannin. So those 2 grape varieties, picking the same, fermentation the same. It's a smaller batch, whilst the non-vintage is a batch of 45, 50 different vineyards. This is a batch of 30 different vineyards scattered hither, thither. And then rather than 4 years in the cellar, this is nearer 8 years in the cellar. So it's got more time on what we call the lees, those dead yeast cells. Once they fall down, the wine picks up flavour. And also the Pinot Noir has that ability to pick up flavour from the yeast cells. So far, I don't know whether you've got it on that guy, but it's more, you've got more yeastiness, more butterscotch, all those sort of yeasty, brioche elements that are coming in to give the wine structure. But then you've really got that terrific.
Sorry,
you've got that great fresh.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, it's interesting because that was the first thing I picked up on the nose. There's much more development here. It's not quite as fresh and as crisp. It's rounder, and it's a very key indication as to what the palate can expect. Obviously, you pick up on the aromas, and everything you're speaking about was exactly as it came through. And as you say, on the palate, there is much more of the yeasty breadiness from the development.
It's nice got that. Keep going.
I was just going to say, it's nice because again, doing it back to back like this is why I love doing these tastings in this manner, is being able to pick out the differences. And it's just that little bit smoother. When the other one had a bit crisper, a bit fresher, which is great. I love wines like that, especially with the English sparklings. But this has got the roundness is probably the best way I'd describe it.
Yep, no, it's starting to show you a little bit of the mature champagne flavour. You can see the colours a little bit dark. The colours a smidgen darker. I mean, that's because, in fact, there's that Pinot Noir. Even though we pick it quickly, we press it quickly, we ferment, you still get a certain pinkish tinge from the Pinot Noir skin. And so if you get from pinkish over time, you get that sort of golden tint to it. But no, it's bigger, it's fatter. The dosage is a little bit lower. But you've also got that terrific capacity to mature. Because Pinot Noir, even a vintage in bottle will last another 10, 15, 20 years. And it's also part of the history of Pol Roger. As I was saying, Pol only brought vintage Pol Roger into the UK market for 100 years. It's only in the late 50s we started bringing non-vintage in. But we still are very strong. And that's sort of the wine drinkers. And that, in terms of value for money, vintage is still terrific value for money. We got a proper wine from proper vineyards from a proper serious year. And we've done part of the maturation for it. One of our lockdown joys has been going through some sort of documents and old price lists. Vintage champagne was twice the price of first growth claret in the early part of the 1900s.
Wow.
First growth claret is now pumping out, I think they're putting them out 5,000 quid a dozen for the 20s at the moment. Vintage champagne is nowhere near as expensive. No. Vintage champagne, it looks expensive, but it's fallen behind its peers. And I think qualitatively it's been getting better over the years. And it's just a question at the moment of finding what house style you like. And there's absolutely no difference in the winemaking style at Pol. It's more just that quality of grapes. And I think the other thing with your English sparkling wine hat on, I think what we just also need to remember is we have that broader spectrum of vineyards to play with. And while Pol, we've got 91, 92 hectares of vineyards, but unlike Bordeaux or Burgundy, where that 92 hectares are consecutive, effectively 90 odd hectares is we've got vineyards in 30 different areas.
Yeah.
And then we're buying for another 90 odd hectares in another 30 or so areas. And so we can be picking grapes. It can be 15, 20, 30 miles away from each other. And that, I think, patchwork is where I think Champagne Noir would say that's where we can do that's where blending comes in.
Absolutely.
And so at the blending time, we're talking at 60, 70, 80 different batches. And so you've got those different seasonings you can use. And the one style isn't better. Some people will say a single vineyard champagne is a great champagne. For those of us with lots of different vineyards, of course, we'd say the blended champagne is the better version. But it just gives us an idea of those options we've got in terms of winemaking. And what's the price of a hectare of English, you're my English vineyard man, how much did it cost to buy a hectare of English vineyard planted now?
I don't know, but the difficulty with the vineyards in England is there's not enough land, and it's all in a very small area, and it's in premium locations, so I don't know, but it's expensive.
Okay. No, because the going rate at the moment in Champagne is about 2 million euros a hectare. It's been going up and up and up. So total Champagne vineyard area is 30-odd thousand hectares. There's very small growth going on. There's a bit more Appalachian land being created. But because there's such demand out there, it's about 2 million euros a hectare. Hectares, 100 metres by 100 metres, 2 rugby pitches worth. You get about 10,000 bottles per hectare. And so if you started now, it would be jolly difficult to create an English sparkling wine or champagne house because your fixed costs would be so enormous. But if you own vineyards, it's great. But the rate for the grapes we're all buying in is about €5 a kilo. So you need about 1.5 kilos of grapes to make a decent bottle of champagne. So your fixed costs in champagne are jolly high. We're talking about what, 7 quid, 6, 7 quid, 7, 8 quid. So when you see your $10.99 bottle of champagne at Lidl or Aldi, you can work out it's not coming possibly from the best possible grape vineyards in Champagne.
That's an important point to know, because most people don't take that into consideration. You say with price, because there's always a point of where it is markup. But for the lower value wines, you just have to ask yourself how much has really gone into making this wine, considering the costs that are there.
There are lesser vineyards and better vineyards in Champagne. There's the ability to take a second press. Pol will only take the first pressing. You are allowed to use the second pressing. You're also allowed to start selling your booze at 15 months old, your non-vintage at 15 months old. So there are lots of ways of cutting corners if you're looking for value for money, or else there are lots of ways of adding value and investing in the products as you go along. And I think frankly, the only reason that Pol Roger has remained family owned is we are a premium brand, but we're not just premium because we say we're premium. We're premium because the wine's bloody good. And we've been investing a fortune over the last 20 or 30 years in the winemaking facilities, because that's really what's key. The vineyards are now better than they've ever been, and winemaking, you do need to keep upgrading and upgrading and upgrading, if that's the style you're looking for.
It's an important point that you've raised there, because it is about the continual development of brands, of the vineyards, of the wines, and that is an ever-evolving process, which, as you say, bluntly, you have to keep investing in it. You have to keep moving forward. But then we want the wines to have longevity, and we want the brands to continue forward. It's interesting, obviously, part of the reason I love doing tastings like this is to pick out the differences, and sometimes they're very, very small. But to summarize this champagne over the previous one, this has that little bit more development. There's that little bit more going on there.
I think you'd say it's got a little more personality.
Absolutely.
It's got more personality. It's more serious. I think there is an argument. It's not as easy to drink as the non-vintage. You have to think about it as you're drinking slightly, whether that's a good thing or bad. And the answer is you sort of should start with the non-vintage and move to the vintage with your first course or something. Same game, absolutely flexible food. But I think it's not as flexible as the non-vintage. For that, you're talking serious food. Serious bit of fish with that. That will be absolutely terrific.
Absolutely. That's why, though, because it's more of a refined one. There's a bit more definition to it. So as you say, it's not, you can't just pair it with as many foods, but it's a good thing to have the precision and to be precise.
No, as I say, Pol has a reputation for vintage. If anyone's got any sense with a decent cellar, they should be sitting on their vintage for 10 years, and it makes a great, great wine. And Pol, we are one of the few to take it serious. Most of the rest of Champagne jumps largely straight from non-vintage to prestige cuvee without a lot of a stop in between, because historically we've always done vintage. And as we're about to move on to the next wine, Churchill only ever drank vintage Pol Roger and only ever drank mature vintage Pol Roger. And so we're trying to continue that story, continue that that history of Pol Roger.
It's not just about the history, though. It's also, you've got to make sure that the quality is there. And as you say, you'll know that from each vintage, which is why a vintage is put out, not just the non-vintage blend. That's the perfect way to move on. So let's try the next one.